Alan Wake is a game that's been on my radar for years at this point. I've always been interested in this series from the outside, but never really found the time to go in and give this thing a shot. However, with the release of the second game on the very near horizon, and a remaster in 2021, I figured what better time to test my interest in the series than now.
My name is Alan Wake. I'm a writer.
To kick things off, this game is nothing like I expected. Granted, I wasn't really sure what to expect, but for some reason, I had it in my mind that this was going to play very similar to Resident Evil 4, a third-person, over-the-shoulder shooter where you battle with baddies in the woods. However, once you get into the gameplay, it's more like Resident Evil 6's more frantic behind-the-back camera, mixed with a game like Slender the Arrival's love for flashlights. This game has a heavy emphasis on the trusty bright stick, with it probably being the most useful and effective tool at your disposal. Alan Wake's journey centers around darkness, and not in a metaphorical sense, but as in shadows that shroud the world and the enemies against your attacks. So, of course, to combat these shadows, you'll use the flashlight. Most things in this game are dealt with by hovering your light over the object until it meets a certain threshold where it'll disappear. Against enemies, this means following them with your light until a threshold is met so that their invulnerabilities will be removed and you can actually shoot them. This little light hover mechanic is far and away the most prevalent thing in this game. You'll use it to fight enemies, get rid of barriers, really every interaction centers around the flashlight, then firearm if applicable. It's to the point where you could think of this almost as a flashlight game instead of a shooter, and that's not to say that it's to its detriment. The using of the flashlight to focus on objects is, in my opinion, more satisfying than the gunplay here. The beam from the flashlight operates as a pseudo-crosshair. This game doesn't have a typical crosshair setup. Instead, the scope is pretty much where you'll aim the flashlight, and your gun will follow that trajectory. I personally like the system, it's different. Of course, it'll take some getting used to. At first, you'll feel like you're just blind firing, but once you get acclimated to it, it'll begin to feel natural. As for the firearms at your disposal, you have your standards, the handguns, shotguns, and hunting rifles, but where you get a real change up is in the more unique light-based weapons. Since your enemies have a vitamin D deficiency, this game plays around scaring enemies away with light. Obviously the flashlight, but checkpoints are also identified by streetlights. You'll get flares that are good for a temporary reprieve, flashbangs to eliminate most enemies instantly, and even a flare gun, which can be used to one-hit enemies at a distance. To describe what it's like to play this game, I'll kick you a typical gameplay loop. You'll walk into a shadowy area, the landscape will begin to blur, and 3 or 4 enemies will walk out from the woods. They'll attack you, and you'll back away, trying to get the circles to close so that you can shoot them. You also have a dodge mechanic if they successfully close the distance, which is very useful even if its function is pretty rudimentary. That scenario is basically what this game is in terms of how it plays. There are no true bosses, and there are maybe 5 or 6 various enemy types. There are also various things that can get possessed by darkness and try to end you, but the flashlight is everything's kryptonite, so it never feels that different. For me, the loop didn't really get too repetitive until my second playthrough, but it also never really gripped me as exceptional. However, if I had to guess, I would say that the Alan Wake developers almost saw the gameplay as a complementary experience to the story. This game has so much story. A lot of your time will be spent just in cutscenes and listening to things like radio broadcasts and television programs.
Deep indeed. In Night Springs. Tonight's episode, a quantum suicide.
Now, let me first say that I'm going to spoil this story. I've got a lot of things that I want to talk about, specifically the ending, so if you're late to this game but want to go in fresh, just be forewarned. Alan Wake centers around the character of the same name, who's a writer from New York. He's written a well-regarded series of books, but after killing off the main character in his latest, he's been struggling to rekindle his fictional flame. His wife Alice decides that in order to help him with the stresses that he's been feeling from being unable to continue his work, she's going to book a place in a quiet mountain town known as Bright Falls to hopefully get him some inspiration. When he arrives in town, we quickly get to see just how much of a celebrity Alan actually is as he interacts with a few of the locals. Entering a coffee shop where he's supposed to meet with the property owner to get the keys for the rental, Alan is approached by a woman in black who says that the man couldn't make it and instead gives him her set and a map to his destination. As the pair gets settled in though, Alice springs on Alan that this isn't just a relaxing getaway. In the other room, she set up a typewriter in the hopes that the scenery can snap him out of his creative coma. Angry at the deception, Alan leaves the house only to hear his wife's cries back inside. Rushing back to check on her, he finds that she's fallen into the lake, and he worriedly jumps in to save her. However, after a brief blackout, Alan doesn't find himself awaking on the lake's pier, but instead in the driver's seat of a crashed car. Understandably confused, with no recollection of how he got there, the only thing he's sure of is that his wife is in danger. With the car having crashed in the middle of the woods, he begins to try and work his way to the gas station he can see beyond the ravine. On his journey though, he makes an interesting discovery that defines much of this game's narrative. A page of a manuscript written by him that is describing the very events that he's currently living. Yet again, with no recollection of writing these pages, he presses on until eventually making his way to a lumberyard. Here, he meets a darkness-possessed Carl Stuckey, the man who he was supposed to run the cabin off of, who attacks. Forced to defend himself, Alan kills Stuckey and continues to the gas station to look for help. While going through the station though, a TV kicks on of Alan in the room from the cabin, writing and talking crazy. More confused than ever, he presses on to find a phone and call the police, with the sheriff arriving and telling Alan that there is no island on Cauldron Lake. A couple of things here. That's the end of episode 1. Yes, this game has literal episodes. From a cursory scan on Wikipedia, apparently Remedy's initial plan was to release this episodically, but Microsoft pushed them not to. I don't know, but what I do know is I'm not a fan of it. I've never seen the point of this. I've seen it in games before and it makes them feel disjointed, but here it's even worse, because they theoretically would have had to adhere to the idea that someone could buy episode 4 without playing 1 through 3. At the end of every episode, Alan loses everything. Now, it's not a big deal, but it kills any lasting progression. You find a better flashlight on your path? You lose it. You enjoy that double-barreled shotgun? Say goodbye. You've been scrounging supplies from the hidden caches. Why? You're gonna lose all those flares in about 45 minutes anyway. Maybe it's just a me thing, but I don't like it when the hero gets no new skills on his journey. You could take Alan from episode 1, move him directly to episode 6, and he can still use a flashlight just as well. Anyway, continuing into episode 2, we begin in a flashback of Alan's life back in New York City. He and Alice talk about his latest novel before the lights kick off, revealing to us that Alice is terrified of the dark. This detail is almost worthless in the grand scheme of things, but it introduces to us an item called the clicker, which would become prominent in the future.
I used to have these nightmares when I was a kid. The dark really spooked me, too. When it got really bad, my mom gave me this old light switch. She called it the clicker.
The clicker, huh?
Yeah. If I ever got scared of the dark, I could just flip the switch and a magic light would scare the monsters away.
Oh, sure.
For now, though, this memory ends and we come back to the current day being inspected by the town doctor. He essentially says we're fine, and we come out of the room to meet back up with Sheriff Sarah. She's got a grand total of 3 questions for us, all of which we ignore before we get a call from an unknown number. Excusing ourselves from the conversation, we take the call, and it's a man telling us that he's kidnapped our wife, giving us a location to meet up, his only request being the future-telling manuscript. With no other options, we prepare to leave the precinct, but before we can go, we meet up with a creative psychologist named Dr. Hartman. Apparently, he was the one who invited Alice to bring Alan to Bright Falls, and for the treachery, we give him a swift nose check.
My clinic is a place where...
Oh, hey, oh my! Take it easy.
Fortunately for us, this is a town of no consequences, as our agent and best friend Barry Wheeler walks through the door and threatens to sue. With Barry in tow, we walk out of the precinct and head in the general direction of where we're to meet up with the kidnapper. We get there and meet with Rose, the waitress from the diner, and then Rusty, a ranger who was also at the diner. To take a brief pause, this game has a good number of characters in it. Most of the important ones we either met at the diner earlier or we just met at the police station. This game kind of front loads these characters, and then we're left to see what happens to them later on in the tale. We'll discuss them as they reach their conclusions in the story, but for now, just know that Barry is the best and no others compare. Barry and Alan end up renting a cabin in the forest so that Alan can be closer to the location where he's to meet the kidnapper. Leaving a skeptical Barry behind, Alan begins his hike to the destination. Making his way back down from the cabin, he ends up finding Rusty where we left him, but now in a much worse state. He attempts to get the generator kicked on to protect the wounded Rusty from the darkness, but ultimately fails, leading to an attack from a Shadow Rusty. Rusty is a character that is very unimportant to Alan, but has a somewhat interesting backstory that makes him feel unfinished. According to the manuscript, he and Rose had a thing for each other, but it never went anywhere because she had higher aspirations, making his tale one of a love story that never was. Anyway, he dead, so we continue on toward the meetup where we meet a curmudgeonly man whom we met earlier on the ferry inn. Alan deduces that this guy's the kidnapper, but we lost our guns, so we have no choice but to follow him up the mountainside. Once they reach the point, the kidnapper confirms that he's the kidnapper, and tells Alan that he wants the entire manuscript brought to him or Alice will
Suffer bad.
Alan, doing what he does best, punches the man and they both fall off the balcony before the kidnapper runs away into the night. Having nothing else to do, Alan returns to the cabin where he left Barry to plot their next move, but not before taking out a flock of darkness birds before Barry will let him in. The attack convincing Barry that Alan's not crazy and that there is something happening here beyond his understanding. The episode ending with Barry getting a call from a strange-sounding Rose who claims to have the rest of the manuscript pages that the kidnapper is requesting. This may be my least favorite episode because it's almost pointless. Most of the time is spent going to a person who in the end just kicks the can down the road to meet up later. There's not even that much to say about it other than we meet a lot of characters, but they'll be discussed later, so yeah. Anyway, the third episode opens up with us going to Rose's to try and recover the lost manuscript pages. However, she's been corrupted by darkness and ends up drugging Barry and Alan, with us waking up sometime later. Rose is an interesting character who plays a bit of an odd role. We meet her at the diner and Barry gets a little crush on her, but she's by and large unimportant and this is almost the last that we see of her. Wake is her favorite author and she somewhat idolizes him. Manuscript pages even referencing her wanting to be his muse, which is a concept that we'll discuss later because it may tie her deeper into the story than just the surface level we see here. Regardless, we leave Rose's and start to walk back to the truck to bring it around and retrieve the still unconscious Barry. Before we can manage that though, the worst written and most pointless character in this game, FBI Agent Nightingale, arrives to try and capture or kill us. Luckily, we escape into the woods and begin to run from the unhinged detective toward the radio station. Eventually, we arrive there and meet another man by the name of Pat Mays, who we also first encountered on the ferry ride in. Unfortunately, the cops show up and Nightingale shows us again just how thirsty he is for our blood when he shoots up the studio with Pat still inside. Fleeing back into the safety of the woods, we start our trek to the meetup spot that the kidnapper gave us the night prior, all the while being attacked by shadowy people and possessed machinery, of course. We arrive at the old mining facility where Alan was told to meet the kidnapper, but wouldn't you know it, he never shows up. Instead, we have to go all the way to another random place, where this time Alice is surely being held, right? Well, we finally get there, and it was all a lie. This was all a huge waste of time, and forever believing it, Alan gets tossed into the lake. This episode has some interesting things in it. I like the run-in we have with Rose and getting to see her obsession with Alan. Then I also like the stuff at the radio station with Pat because I like his character. You can hear him occasionally on radios scattered throughout the world, but we're halfway through this game and the last two episodes have been wild goose chases. Not to mention the fact that we got introduced to Nightingale, who we'll talk about later but is useless. Thankfully, episode 4 is where the story starts to pick up a little more as we wake up in a room at Dr. Hartman's clinic, who's fished us out of the water after our great tumble. The first section of this episode is basically an on-rails exposition dump and provides us with one of the several potential story resolutions that the game gives us, that being Hartman's version of what's happening to Alan. Hartman tells us that everything we've been experiencing is the result of a mental break Alan suffered after the death of his wife in a tragic car accident. Alan, of course, doesn't believe this, but has some inner conflict about if it's possible. Ultimately, though, he deems Hartman not credible, and we get an interesting interaction between Alan and the Anderson brothers. These elderly rockers were introduced to us back at the diner and are at Hartman's clinic because he supposedly provides counseling to artistic individuals who've been having issues. However, it's not so much them as it is what they call us in this particular run-in that I find interesting.
Zane, you're all right, Tom. Hey, we like him, don't we, bro? He's got to go to the farm. The Anderson farm.
Thomas Zane is a character that ties deeply into the events of this game. He was a poet that died in the 70s and was sort of the precursor to the role that Alan is now filling. We'll talk about Zane closer to the end, but for now just know that Zane was the owner of the Cauldron Lake house where he lived with his wife. They both died in the eruption of the area back in the 70s, and this old woman with the lamp, whom we met at the diner, was obsessed with him back in the day, much like Rose is with Alan. Anyways, we head back to the room and try to placate Hartman's wishes to write something because he has one of his orderlies breathing down our neck. A commotion caused by the Andersons, though, gives Alan the opportunity to escape and explore the area. This exploration resulting in us finding some interesting things. Firstly, we get to hear a few recordings of Hartman's recent conversations. One with Alice telling him about the issues she's been having with Alan, one with Detective Nightingale who thinks that Hartman is hiding Alan, and finally one with the kidnapper whom Hartman refers to as Mott. Mott was apparently working on behalf of Hartman, who wanted Alan's manuscript in order to make a profit off the acclaimed writer's work. That's his whole racket. Hartman finds these talented individuals, provides them help, and then tries to make money off their ventures, seeing himself as something of a producer. Exploring a bit more, we stumble upon Barry, whom Hartman has locked in a room beside his office. And once we enter that office, we find the doctor who tries to sway us to reconsider his help. We refuse and hold him at gunpoint as the darkness begins to fill the room. And as it engulfs, we shut the door behind us as Hartman is totally consumed. This is the last that we see of the good doctor, and I don't really like that. Hartman is the second in a list of very unsatisfying endings to the stories of these characters, specifically antagonists, that we encounter. The first being Mott, whom I guess died in the darkness tornado that threw us off the cliff at the end of the last episode. And now, Hartman. Unfortunately, it's a trend that will continue at least once more. Back to the story though, Alan and Barry quickly flee the deteriorating situation at the Institute and decide to head to the Anderson farm in search of the old-timers who seem to know something about what's happening here. This is also where Barry becomes the best character with this little line that I quite enjoyed.
Big time for this. When this is through, if we make it, I don't care what anybody says, I'm done with darkness. You're gonna buy me a tanning bed as a gift, and I'm gonna live in it.
On the road, they end up crashing and getting separated, but after much hardship, reconnect and throw the best darn rock concert this game has to offer. Yeah, there's a rock concert. The Anderson brothers used to be rock stars back in the day with a Norse-inspired gimmick. Anyway, after the pyrotechnics and a bit of exploration in the area, we make our way to the brothers' house, and they aren't there. We do, however, hear a record they made back in the day, which refers to the Lady of the Light. Assuming this to be a reference to Cynthia Weaver, the lamp lady from the restaurant, Alan decides to hunt her down with some questions. First though, they decide it's a great time to get absolutely obliterated on some of the Andersons' homemade moonshine.
What do they put in this stuff? I feel like my brain is coming out of my nose.
This astounding alcohol manages to put Alan so far under the table that he remembers the events from that fateful night when he arrived here. He finds that after he jumped into the water, he wasn't able to get his wife. Instead, once he emerged, he met the woman in black from the restaurant, who tells him that she knows how to save Alice. This woman is darkness incarnate, and not just as a metaphor, but that's literally what she is. She's the wife of Thomas Zane, who died and was reborn through the darkness possessing her. As for what she wants with Alan, she wants him to write a manuscript that will become real through the magic of the lake. Alan will write the story, and in it, she will become more and more powerful. Alan referring to her as his editor. The videos that we keep seeing of Alan in the room from the cabin, these are videos of the time he spent writing the story that was now unfolding before his eyes. He was in a kind of trance during that time, but in his subconscious, he managed to script his own escape into the story by calling on Thomas Zane to be his, I guess, beacon of light. With this newly regained knowledge, Alan wakes up to find Detective Nightingale yet again pointing a gun at him. The episode ending on that cliffhanger. We get a lot of information during this episode, and I'm sure some of it was difficult to follow, specifically the stuff about Zane and his wife, who is now Darkness. To go into the backstory we're given for Zane, he and his wife Barbara Jagger lived in the cabin on Cauldron Lake. He was a famous poet, and his wife was his muse. One day she drowned in the lake, and depressed, he would use these supernatural powers he'd found here to bring her back to life. Unfortunately, what came back wasn't her. It was the darkness of this place wearing her face. Fearful of what he'd wrought on the world, he would again invoke the power of the lake to erase himself, his wife, and his work from existence, with the caveat that any work of his in a shoebox would survive the erasure, writing a specific page which he would give to Cynthia Weaver, a devoted fan who would follow his commands for the entirety of her life. This is all stuff that'll be expounded upon by Cynthia Weaver herself in the next episode, but I want to get it out of the way between episodes so I don't have to derail the events that are happening present day.
I think my tongue just took a crap in my mouth. Ugh. Oh.
Having been captured by Nightingale, Alan and Barry wake up in a jail cell at the sheriff's department. Nightingale, in a twist that no one could have seen coming, pulls a gun on them even after they've already been arrested. Fortunately for Alan and us, the darkness pulls him off screen, and that's almost the last that we see of him. Sheriff Sarah, now seeing firsthand what we've been dealing with, releases the duo from the cell, and we prepare for our trek to the decommissioned power plant that Cynthia Weaver somehow purchased on her modest, crazy lamp lady salary. We battle our way through the town that's become overrun by shadow and eventually make our way to a helicopter. Sarah flies us to the plant, but after an attack from some ravens, Alan falls from the chopper and finds himself yet again separated. Once again battling off the darkness of the area, we finally make our way to the power plant, meeting up with Cynthia, who reveals the backstory of her forlorn love, Thomas Zane. We begin to follow her to the place where she's hidden away something he left behind for Alan, but a helicopter crash of Barry and Sarah pulls us away from the safe path to try and help our friends. We promise to meet back up with Cynthia at the well-lit room and head to the helicopter crash. Barry and Sarah made it out of the crash unscathed, but are now battling hordes of Taken. That's what these possessed people are called. Can't remember if I actually mentioned that, but we help them, get on an elevator, get separated again, and finally get reconnected. It's a whole thing. With the gang all here, we enter the well-lit room where Alan discovers a shoebox containing a manuscript page by Thomas Zane, as well as an item that you may recall from episode 2, the clicker. This revelation ending the episode as we get into the game's climax. This episode sets into motion some very interesting events for how the story will eventually play out. The manuscript page that Alan gets here was written by Zane, but it's about Alan. Specifically, it's about the time that his mother gave him the clicker to fight away the darkness that he used to fear as a child. This points to what I think is the most interesting ponderance, that Alan is a creation of Thomas Zane. Implications of what this means being difficult to wrap your head around, but we'll get into all of that at this game's conclusion. For now, we re-emerge with Alan in another flashback from his life back in New York, way before Bright Falls. He'd had a television interview the night prior to promote his book, and as a celebration, Barry had taken him out for drinks. As a result, he and Alice get into an argument, and I guess this is supposed to just give us more context on where she was coming from in her previously established discussions with Hartman, although they immediately get over it, so I'm not sure what the point of this part is. Regardless, after the short diversion, we come back to the present day, with Alan now knowing what he must do. Taking the clicker and telling everyone else to stay behind, he commits to seeing this through by himself like a true story's hero. Hell-bent on showing the darkness what for, Alan heads back to where this nightmare all began, the Cauldron Lake cabin. Jagger, of course, doesn't make things easy for him, throwing every tool in her arsenal at the writer as he runs through more AA batteries than the Energizer Bunny. Eventually, he finds himself face to face with the darkness tornado that's been plaguing his journey. A few well-placed flare gun shots sending it back to the depths of the lake. However, knowing this isn't over, Alan grasps the clicker and jumps in after it, waking up back in his old New York apartment next to Alice, who is totally the real one, no questions.
Everything's fine.
Somehow seeing through this masterful deception, Alan presses on. Thomas Zane then appears, and for some reason, Alan gets a doppelganger that plays no true role in the story, and I have no idea why it's here. In the DLC, he gets the name Mr. Scratch, and apparently he is a big part of the quasi-sequel Alan Wake American Nightmare, but I didn't play that, so it makes no sense other than, I guess, sequel bait. Anyway, Scratch and Zane leave, and we enter this deeper Shadow Realm. The world here hasn't even been written yet, and so we can make things appear out of thin air just by focusing on concepts and making them manifest with our light. We proceed on, coming to the cabin where this all began, finding Barbara Jagger's possessed corpse inside. Conveniently, we can now see a giant, gaping, clicker-sized hole in her chest, and so Alan decides to fill it. The specter of Jagger now disintegrated at our feet, Alan is now alone in the darkness of the cabin, free to write an ending to the story that he just lived. He frees Alice from her prison in the darkness of the lake, and in the town of Bright Falls, the remnants of the area celebrate Deerfest. But the ending of the story isn't nearly as happy for everyone. Rose holding a lamp as an evil nightingale looks on at the festivities from a boarded up window. And as for Alan, he stays behind in the magical dark place under Cauldron Lake, the presence seemingly consuming him.
It's not a lake. It's an ocean.
This is the end of the game, and of course I have some things to say about it. Now that Nightingale's part in the game is over, I can tell you why he is such a worthless character and how he embodies a bigger issue for this game. Let me give you the details that we have about Nightingale. He's with the FBI, and he drinks a lot. That's it! That's all we know. And we don't even really know that because Sheriff Sarah keeps questioning it.
Agent Nightingale, your opinion would matter more if you were sober and if I actually believed you were here on official business.
For me, this is an issue. I thought maybe I just missed some manuscript pages and it was all explained in the document somewhere, but that's not even the case. Apparently, the only backstory that we get for Nightingale comes from a non-canon novelization of the game, in which his partner was killed by the darkness. However, that gives no reason for why he has such an irrational hatred of Alan. If anything, he should be trying to help him beat back the evil. Nightingale is basically the secondary antagonist for the game, and we get absolutely nothing about him. His hunt for Alan impacts so much of the narrative, and then we don't even get a satisfying ending to him. Not to mention no, and I mean literally zero reason for his passionate pursuit. I kept expecting a page talking about how Alan slept with Nightingale's wife or something, and we get none of that. We even get to go to Nightingale's motel room, and there is absolutely nothing there. But I suppose my real issue is with just how poorly written his downfall actually was, and this is an issue that I have with the game in general. Mott, Hartman, Nightingale, they all just kind of get swept up by darkness, and we never get a satisfying conclusion to these characters that caused us such headache. We get so many interactions with these people, and then they're just gone. Cut from the story while we deal with what is essentially a non-character, the darkness. With that ending though, there are some things about the ending that I liked. I like that Alan doesn't get to go back to his life. So many games end and it's just a really terrible night for these characters. To get a character that actually has to sacrifice everything for the happy ending of another is welcome to me. I also like the kind of cyclical parallels we see with Rose at the end. Rose essentially becomes Cynthia Weaver. I don't know in what sense, other than fearing darkness, but she wanted to be Alan's muse just as Weaver wanted to be Thomas Zane's. Alan then becomes Zane, but Zane that was successful in freeing his wife from the darkness, with Alice being the modern-day Jagger who survived the perils of the lake. I don't know what all this means, but I think it's interesting. And another thing of interest is the bombshell that Zane wrote the clicker into Wake's story. I suppose this means that Zane is the author of Alan's life. However, in the DLC, he says that he's not.
I am not the author of your story.
How can you say that when you wrote that page about me in the clicker? It wasn't one of my pages. You directed me to it. You had Weaver guard it.
Yes, she was needed. And you needed the clicker. But I know.
I don't know what to make of that. Then there's also the snippet back at Hartman's clinic of the Anderson brothers calling Wake Zane. I don't know what to make of that either. Could Wake actually be Zane? Could he have suffered some kind of mental break after his wife died at Cauldron Lake and to cope created this persona? Or do the Andersons just see the similarities between the two and get confused because they're old? I don't have the answers to these questions, and some of the times I feel like it adds to the mystery, and sometimes I feel like it's just bad writing. But we still have some DLC to go through, so we'll do that before I reach my conclusions. We begin with Alan taking a walk through Bright Falls, stepping into the diner but noticing that something's different. The people inside are hollow versions of themselves, and as he walks back into the bathroom, he gets a transmission from Thomas Zane. Zane tells us that we're losing ourselves in the darkness, telling Wake to follow him to try and save himself. Then we get a transmission from a now very deranged version of Wake through the television. We leave the bathroom and head in the direction of Zane's signal to find a manuscript page. Inspecting the page doesn't work in the same way as it did in the base game though, now expanding words into the world that can be uncovered with the use of a flashlight. This is the main new gameplay mechanic for the DLC. These little word bubbles that we got a little bit of at the very climax of the base game are now everywhere. They replace things like the caches and just exploring for items on the ground. Other than that though, the gameplay is basically the same. Wake heads deeper into the town, following Zane's signal, and finds that everything is crumbling around us. The world that we once knew now impossibly distorted, as it becomes clear that this isn't the true Bright Falls, a point accentuated by a false Barry who outright says he's a figment of our imagination. Continuing on, we fight off dozens of Taken and eventually find Zane in a memory of our old apartment. Zane tells us that we've been fighting with ourselves this entire time, that we're trapped in our own nightmares as an irrational part of ourselves has been trying to kill us. And to prove the floating diving suit man correct, we immediately try to do it again. Alan manages to beat back this dark part of himself, and the episode ends with him writhing on the ground in broken agony. I'll save most of the wrap up for after the second DLC, but here I'll say that this is a lot more gameplay focused than the base game. We still have some story, but Remedy takes concepts from base, expands them, and gives them more exposure. I enjoy it. It makes the experience feel more unique because in base it can feel very samey. Here though, the environments are more distinct with different challenges. There's an area with a ton of light poles breaking out of the ground and you can use them to peel enemies off your back. There's an area where there's like a minefield of words that you have to avoid shining your flashlight on because they'll spawn perils. I like it. It gives you new challenges. And these changes flow into the second DLC as well. Here, we start back in Fakeville, this time at Hartman's clinic. We get locked on the side of a gate away from Fake Barry and have to work our way through the hedge maze and back to the clinic. Several memories have been mashed together, and we now have a rock concert on the front area of the hospital. Once we make our way inside though, Fake Barry leaves us and we start to follow Zane again, who's as cryptic as ever. We follow the path that's laid before us and after many perils, eventually find our way back to the lighthouse from the tutorial. We ascend it, and in our fractured brain, it leads to Diver's Isle. Here, Fake Barry has gotten jealous of our relationship with Zane, and once we reach the cabin, he attacks with several other people from the Bright Falls adventure. Defeating them, we walk into the cabin, interacting with our broken self on the floor, and allowing Alan to come back to his senses. The episode ending with the beginning of a new manuscript, this time called Return. The second DLC has some significant changes from the first, namely in its odd focus of platforming. Some of the sequences feature a lot of using the game's very rudimentary jump function to mildly annoying results, specifically this one with a rotating house that you have to run around. In their totality, I like some of the things that were tried in the DLC. I think that the floating words were a nice continuation of an idea that was in the end of base game. However, in terms of the story, I think it was mostly nothing. We start the game where we ended it, at the typewriter. The Alan that we play isn't even the real Alan. The town that we go through isn't even the real Bright Falls. The Barry that we deal with isn't the real Barry. This all takes place inside of Alan's mind. We play a small portion of himself that's trying to save him from complete madness. It's all self-contained. The only real thing that affects anything outside of this DLC is our interactions with Thomas Zane, but he basically gives us nothing and ignores our questions. The whole thing just feels very convoluted, and that's how I describe everything this story has to offer, even in the base game. There are so many things that lead to nothing and have no resolution, and I feel like don't even make sense in the grand scheme of it. It just feels like we're being led along with the carrot of a story that we never really get to fully enjoy because Remedy doesn't take any steps to get to know or understand these characters. We get the most with Alan, and I like his character, but even he doesn't truly get fleshed out. And while I think that it's intentional to some degree, the opening monologue even saying,
"In a horror story, the victim keeps asking why, but there can be no explanation, and there shouldn't be one. The unanswered mystery is what stays with us the longest, and it's what we'll remember in the end."
I think there's only really mystery if you can speculate in the reality presented. To go back to Nightingale from the base game, I have nothing to go on. There is literally nothing there to speculate on. In the novelization, he has this backstory of his partner dying to the darkness. Granted, I haven't read the book, but that gives me a basis from which to craft something for him. For example, Alan's latest book was centered around a detective or something who died in the line of duty. I believe that was the story. I don't know if we're given specifics, but say that in the book the man died identically to how Nightingale's partner died. The detective read the book and becomes convinced that Alan had something to do with the murder. But we don't get something like that. Instead, we get a guy who keeps calling us the wrong name and has a gun surgically attached to his hand.
Get him up, Hemingway!
Nowhere to run now, Dan Brown.
That's right, James Joyce.
I've got you now, Raymond Chandler. It's all here. All the evidence, including conspiracy to murder a federal agent. There's no way you're walking out of here. You hear me in there, Bret Easton Ellis? Huh?
All in all, I would say that Alan Wake was a bit of a letdown for me. I don't think it's a terrible game, but I was kind of expecting a forgotten masterpiece, and I certainly didn't get it. I do think that the gameplay is good. Again, the flashlight beam as a reticle is a neat concept, and the simple but effective loop is fun. However, the story, which I think was the main focus here, didn't catch me. To be fair though, this more abstract evil kind of horror isn't really my thing. So for me, I think I'd give this like a high 6 or low 7 out of 10. I had a decent time with it, but it's not as strong a title as I think it could have been. I'm still looking forward to the sequel whenever I can get around to it, and I also know that Remedy has grown quite a bit as a studio since this game's release in 2010. I played Control not that long ago, and if nothing else, I remember the gameplay being quite good. And as much as I've harped on it, I'll be interested to see where they take this story. Anyways, thank you all for watching this very brief review on my thoughts of the game. If I missed anything, feel free to let me know in the comments below, and based on the reception this game has, I feel like people won't love me giving it a 6, but I can't imagine that many people are going to make it to the end of this video anyways, so if you did, thank you all for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.